Who is Jim Halpert? Why does he hate costumes? And what does this mean for our investigation? In part 4 of our pilot analysis series on the Anti-Strangling Task Force. For those following the investigation closely, you'll know that the Season 1 intro sequence is actually telling us a story, with that story being the series of events that preceded the arrival of the camera crew to Dunder Mifflin. Now, we had gotten about halfway through it, and for those who haven't seen that analysis, I've linked it here for you. So we got up to the shot of Jim making the call, and as I discussed in the first part of our pilot analysis, it was Jim who called the camera crew into Dunder Mifflin. So the first thing we're going to do is analyze the framing of this shot, because in this shot Jim is symbolically representing himself but also the media that he contacted. If you look at his mannerisms, it does come across as a reporter who's just gotten a new lead. It certainly isn't the sort of reaction we'd expect for a call to the police, for example. This is the sort of reaction we'd expect out of a journalist who's just got a hot tip. They're quickly writing everything down, and we can see a little bit of urgency in this scene. And I'm sure, as a lot of you are familiar, in the world of mass media, time is of the essence. Whoever goes out with the story first, it builds legitimacy and credibility. It's one of those things that's often referenced by media outlets, where we were first to the scene with this story, we are the ones you should be following, we're the publication that you should be purchasing. If we look at how that call is being taken and how the notes are being taken, it really does parallel with a journalist who's just gotten a hot tip. And in this case, that hot tip has come from Jim Halpert. Now, this interpretation is actually supported by the following shot, which is the highlighting and circling of the frontages document. Fans have been saying for years that it's an irking reality that someone would circle with a highlighter, right? It's just not something you would do, but we need to look at this from a symbolic perspective. It's highlighting and it's encircling. In the Season 1 overview, we did touch on this document a little bit and its significance, because the hedges are in fact symbolic in themselves, and in Season 1, it seems as though the office doesn't actually have hedges around it. You can see here in the deleted scenes of Diversity Day, a very clear shot of the Dunder Mifflin car park, and there are no hedges. And in this particular scene, Michael's trying to draw our attention to that, and Dwight is trying to draw our attention away from that. It's a classic misdirection. So there is significance to the hedges, but in the context of Jim being the informant to the media, what we're really being told is the highlighting and the encircling is the media's arrival to the Dunder Mifflin property. Dunder Mifflin has been highlighted as a business or as a place of interest, and once the media arrive, they encircle it, they surround it. It wouldn't be hard to imagine what this would look like. We know that the frontages at Dunder Mifflin are relatively sort of lengthy, and we could certainly fit a number of reporters with their own camera crews out the front of the fence line, doing their own little story or pitching their series of events. That's what we're actually being told. Dunder Mifflin gets highlighted, then encircled. And this starts to give us a bit of a better idea of how the hedges ended up at Dunder Mifflin in the first place, because as I said, we can't see them in Diversity Day, and obviously at some point after Season 1, Dunder Mifflin decides to upgrade its frontages. So the symbolic interpretation of Jim's shot and the following shot is relatively straightforward. Jim contacted the media highlights Dunder Mifflin as an area of interest, they get to the property, and then they surround it with cameras, reporters, and it would have been a day of mayhem, really, when you think about it. Now, if we accept this interpretation, it does actually raise a number of very serious questions, like why did he call them, or what does Jim know? But the real important question is, who the hell is Jim Halpert? And we're going to start our analysis here, because understanding who he is gives you the answer for what he did that day. Firstly, Dwight makes his suspicions unequivocally clear.
I would listen to my homemade test because your husband is definitely lying. In fact, he's lied about every question, even his name. Who are you really? Doesn't it worry you in the slightest That Jim is not his real name?
We need to remember, guys, that Dwight was a volunteer sheriff's deputy, and he openly admits to having access to people's medical records.
As a volunteer sheriff, I can look up anyone's psychiatric records or surgical histories. Yeast infections.
We also know that he's not the only volunteer sheriff's deputy either.
I need you to do something for me.
Yes, anything.
I want you to dig up some dirt on Josh, find out if there are any skeletons in his attic.
I'll talk to my buddy down at the station staff.
So Dwight has access to these police records via more than one route of access. So it's actually pretty straightforward why Dwight has an issue with Jim. Dwight has searched on the police database. He cannot find the name Jim Halpert. His name doesn't exist. Jim Halpert's true identity is unknown to Dwight, and this is why Dwight is highly suspicious of Jim throughout the entire series. He constantly keeps Jim in his periphery because he doesn't know who he is. We also have a very strong motif around questioning Jim's name. This is something that we touched on in the Season 1 DVD cover analysis, but we're going to go a little bit deeper this time.
That's what she said.
We obviously have the scene with Dwight that we covered.
Who are you really?
We have the infamous Jim, James, Jimothy scene with Michael.
Well, to be fair, Jim, James, Jimothy.
Now, not only is this moment supporting the motif of questioning Jim's name, if you've been following the investigation closely, you'll notice that something immediately stands out.
Jim, James, Jimothy.
Another echo of the Curse of Three.
Also, 3 is unlucky. Curse of 3.
The Curse of Three is one of the foundational pillars of the Dunder Code. Every time this curse is echoed, it links back to the Scranton Strangler mystery. Every single time. But the two examples that really start to build out the picture for us are Niagara and the christening. At the christening, Jim's surname is referred to as Halpert.
Before we go, I'd like to remind everyone that the Halperts have been kind enough to host a reception next door immediately following the service.
Halbert.
At Niagara Falls, twice we see the camera focusing in on Jim's surname, this time spelt Halpert. So the surname Halpert actually forms its own motif in this episode. So the creators are really drawing our attention to his surname. So what are the creators trying to tell us? If we look at the christening, we could in isolation assume that we just have a mistake, right? It's not an impossible or difficult hypothesis to entertain. It is a legitimate possibility. But at Niagara, we see it twice. Twice is not a mistake. A mistake done twice is a decision. This error undoubtedly would have been noticed at check-in.
Halpert.
And Beasley. Tonight we're in 2 separate rooms, and then tomorrow night is the honeymoon suite.
Great.
It would have given the hotel an ample amount of time to redo the signs, or at the very least redo the magnetic board. I mean, you don't have to print anything, you just have to switch 2 letters around, right? But it seems as though nothing is done about this. And we have to now ask the question, has the hotel really made a mistake, or is the hotel simply doing what they've been told? What this ultimately suggests is these errors of pronunciation or spelling aren't really the fault of the organization in question. These names or aliases are intentionally given by Jim. Jim is actively conscious in his decision to provide a false name, notwithstanding that the surname Halpert is false in itself. He told the christening his surname was Halbert, and then he tells the hotel at Niagara it's Halpert. Now, this strongly suggests a number of things. It seems apparent that this is about preserving his concealment and concealing his location. So even if we assume Halpert isn't his real surname, most people still know him by that name. If someone did want to track his whereabouts, they will search with the surname Halpert. Let's say with the christening, for example, if they wanted to find out where his daughter is. So what Jim does is he changes 1 letter, changes his surname to Halbert, and let's say any potential stalker or nemesis they would call call around to the various christenings in the area and say, do you have anyone called Halpert? With the aim of Jim obviously being that the christening would say, no, we don't, and that individual would ultimately move on. And it's the same deal with the wedding at Niagara. They will call Niagara, ask, do you have a Halpert? And they will only have a Halpret on the system, and then the intention would be that that person moves on. This seems to be a thought out strategy. So in simple terms, the motive for providing false names is to disguise his whereabouts and to conceal his going-ins and going-outs. Now I'm sure some of you are asking, who's after Jim? What's going on? And we are going to touch on that in another episode, because what you're going to realize by the end of this episode is there is conflict relating to his name and what he does. Now, following this line of reasoning, there are two things that really make sense in this scenario. Jim is worried that someone could be after him. I think that's pretty straightforward. The second possibility is he's trying to bait his possible stalker. So you can see as we start to peel back these layers, the ultimate question is why? Who the hell is Jim that he goes to all this effort? What's so important about Jim? Now, interestingly, it's the police records that start to give us some answers. We've already worked out that Dwight is suspicious of Jim because he cannot locate him on the police database. However, during Take Your Daughter to Work Day, Michael tells us this.
Hey, don't touch him, please!
Man, you've got to be kidding me.
Didn't do background checks of the warehouse guys. Shoo.
So we didn't check the warehouse, right? He only checked the sales floor, but Jim isn't on the system. Firstly, you would assume a police check is done prior to hiring, but this is a check to make sure you're safe to work with children. If you didn't pop up in the system, that would be an immediate red flag, but this doesn't happen. Jimothy passes the police check. There is only one way this is possible. Jim Halpert is an undercover cop. Now, there's two major motifs that support this hypothesis. The first is Jim Halpert's clear aversion to wearing costumes. We see Jim as 3-hole punch Jim.
What is that? What are you supposed to be?
3-hole punch version of Jim. Because you can have me either way. Plain white Jim or 3-hole punch.
Which is basically just Jim Halpert. We see Jim as Dave.
Who are you supposed to be?
Dave.
Which is basically just Jim Halpert. In this old cold open, we see Jim as Bookface.
You're not as scary as a Bookface over there.
Yes, I am the popular social networking site known as Bookface.
Which is basically just Jim again. It's actually a really big deal when Pam finally convinces him to dress up as Popeye, right? And the creators make a point of that. She's the one who finally breaks him. And another notable mention is also when Jim dresses up as Chris Bosch.
I don't know if I can.
Come on, the 3 amigos. 3 kings.
All right.
Do I have to say it, guys? Do I have to say it? I'm gonna say it.
Curse of 3.
So we do have a few of these exceptions, right? Especially the Curse of 3 Kings scene. So it is something that we're gonna pay attention to when we get to that episode. But for the majority of the series, it's fair to say that Jim has an aversion to dressing up in costumes. Now, if you consider the fact that he is an undercover cop, this actually makes complete sense. Why? Because Jim is in costume and character every single day. The costume and character of Jim Halpert. It's likely a serious safety risk if he decides to dress up in a different costume. He could slip up in the moment, he could accidentally reveal his identity. It's an operational risk. The aversion is more likely about self-preservation, but we do see that Jim does get careless. I think the best example is when he uses official police tape to prank Dwight. The second motif, which is not solely linked to Jim, but is overwhelmingly linked to Jim, is the motif of
Call of Duty.
In the episode Email Surveillance, we can see a copy of Call of Duty on Jim's desk. In the same episode, we can see Toby playing Call of Duty. While at Stanford, Jim pretends that he doesn't know how to play Call of Duty.
Jim, are you using the MP40 or the 44?
sniper rifle?
Snipe what? Jim, are you playing for the other team?
You don't snipe in Carrington, okay?
The saboteur! Saboteur!
What game do you think he's referring to here?
Just like I'm not gonna tell my 2-year-old daughter that violent video games are objectively more fun. It's true, but it doesn't help anybody.
What game do you think he's likely playing here?
Oh, come on. Oh, dang it!
You win.
The Call of Duty motif is meant to be taken literally. One who hearkens to the call of duty is one who's in the line of duty. Law enforcement. Call of Duty motif is symbolic of law enforcement. Every time you see this game, the creators are sending you a message about law enforcement. Now, we know the game's not just linked to Jim, but we also know that Jim's already there when the 3 homicides occur. So what's he doing there? Which law enforcement agency does he represent? The true confirmation of this is not provided to us by Jim, because Jim is not the only law enforcement officer at Dunder Mifflin Scranton. And by now you should know, if there isn't one, there's...
Curse of 3.
The confirmation of which agency Jim is a part of is provided to us by somebody's name. A senior, decorated member, also in the Call of Duty. Loved by many. Hated by some. Die. Feared by all.
Detective Michael Scott! I'm with the FBI!
How big do you want this robot? Life size.
No, better make it 2/3. He's here to stop the returns on us.
No one hates machines more than me.
Michael, let's do this!
Michael Scarn shoots and then asks questions later. People will never be replaced by machines. In the end, life and business are about human connections. Michael Scarn, FBI. Looks like there's gonna be a cleanup on aisle 5.
And I bet you're wondering, why do I know so much about Michael Scarn? Well, because I am Michael Scarn.
Oh, yeah! Threat level midnight makes all the girlies feel alright. From Madonna to Madeline Albright. Threat level midnight, it's a threat, a level threat. He's the greatest hockey star I ever seen yet. Threat level what?